Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Minnesota State Office Building, room 300 South, for today's presentation on the 1918 Influenza Pandemic. My name is Brian McDaniel, and I will be your moderator today. This is a topic that interests me a lot in my capacity as lobbyist for many health organizations, but probably most closely associated with this would be the local Public Health Association of Minnesota. Before I introduce our panel, I just wanted to give you a few seconds of background on what we'll be talking about today. The 1918 flu pandemic, which went from January 1918 to December of 1920, was an unusually deadly influenza pandemic involving the H1n1 influenza virus, which we're all aware of. It infected 500 million people around the world and resulted in the deaths of 50 to 100 million or 3 to 5% of the world's population, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history. This month marks the 100th anniversary of the first case in the United States, and we are pleased to have this panel of history and public health experts with us to discuss the 1918 pandemic and what lessons we can draw from it today. Thank you all for being here, and we welcome you here next week when we're going to be presenting Pandemic the Musical. You will see me as worried boy number 4. Our panel today. Dr. Mike Osterholm, to my right, is a Regents professor, McKnight Presidential Endowed Chair in Public Health, the director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, a distinguished teaching professor in the Division of Environmental Health Sciences, School of Public Health, a professor in the Technological Leadership Institute, College of Science and Engineering, and an adjunct professor in the medical school, all at the University of Minnesota. He is the author of the 2017 book, Deadliest Enemy, Our War Against Killer Germs, in which he not only details the most pressing infectious disease threats of our day, but lays out a 9-point strategy on how best to address them, with preventing a global flu pandemic at the top of the list. To my left is Kris Ehresmann, an epidemiologist and director of the Infectious Disease Epidemiology Prevention and Control Division at the Minnesota Department of Health. In this role, she is responsible for HIV, STD, TB, refugee health, and immunization programs, as well as the emerging infection, foodborne, vector-borne, and zoonotic disease activities. Come on, people.
It's real.
Yeah.
It's real.
Ms. Ehresmann received her Bachelor of Science in Nursing from St. Olaf College and her Master of Public Health in Epidemiology from the University of Minnesota. To my far right is Lois Henrickson, and she is the curator of the Wangenstein Historical Library of Biology and Medicine at the University of Minnesota. She has an MLS from the University of Denver and a love of history, which led her to a career in archives and special collections. She worked in the University of Minnesota's archives for a number of years and later made the move to rare books and manuscripts in the Wangenstein Historical Library, which has a specialization in medicine and natural history before 1930. Now that I've given everyone's credentials, we're out of time. Thank you so much. Now, Ms. Henrickson, you wanted to give a little bit of a background of the 1918 pandemic.
So I thought I'd, as a historian and librarian, curator of rare materials, talk a little bit about the pandemic here in Minnesota. And you notice that in front of me, I also have some materials from our collection. So while we are a rare book collection, we also have some artifacts. So in front of me, I have a Gray's Anatomy that belonged to the second director of the Minnesota Department of Health, Henry Brackett. And to the right, I have some artifacts from our collection. In front, you'll see a map. That was a St. Paul map of influenza by the Citizens Committee. And so if we have time at the end of this session, you're welcome to come up and look at some of the artifacts. There's cold remedies, things you might recognize like Vicks Vapor Rub, things for gargling, powders that are antiseptic. The germ theory is fairly new at this time. And of course, there would also have been things like aspirin and things that we still use today. So in Minnesota, as Brian said, a small group of people compared to the 100 million that died. There were about 140,000 influenza cases and about 12,000 Minnesotans. out of the roughly 2,075,705 listed in the 1910 census died. This influenza pandemic was concurrent with both the World War I, it was near the end of World War I, and here in Minnesota with the Cloquet, Duluth, Moose Lake natural disaster, a fire that burned 1,500 square miles and left 450 people dead. So the health services here in Minnesota were stressed when the influenza pandemic came along. Minnesota's mortality rate ranked 26th out of 27 states. Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey had the highest mortality rates. Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin had the lowest. And in both Minneapolis and St. Paul, the first peak occurred on October 19th through October 22nd, and a second peak a little bit later. So what were some of the issues people faced? Communications regarding influenza, coordination between different levels and branches of government, containment measures, infection control, medical resources, and future epidemic preparedness planning. So I just want to talk about a few of them with regard to Minnesota. Communication. Of course, newspapers were one of the primary means of communication in 1918, but in World War I, people were encouraged to print positive news, so it took a while for Spanish flu to really make it into the front page of the paper. Finally, here in Minneapolis on September 14th in the Minneapolis paper, the first article appeared about influenza, also known as Spanish flu. 6 days later, the City Health Commissioner of Minneapolis, H.M. Guilford, said, "Spanish flu does not exist in Minneapolis and never has, but it will probably reach here during the fall." 8 days later, the first case appeared in Wells, Minnesota. And on September 29th, a few days later, they officially declared that influenza had made its way to Minneapolis. On October 1st, so about 2 weeks after the newspaper first announced Spanish flu, Guilford says that Spanish influenza is becoming increasingly of interest to civilians, but it's not reportable by law, and the health department is kept informed only by the courtesy of physicians. So gathering information, the State Board of Health is up against some serious difficulties. Other documents, official documents, spread the news. Dr. Bracken, whose Grey's Anatomy we have up here, sent a telegram at night to the U.S. Public Health Service on October 2nd saying, "Please send 100 copies of your supplement, Epidemic Influenza." The next day, October 3rd, he sent another night telegram, "Please send 10,000 copies." The flu is moving very rapidly. Other means of communication were enlisted, postal workers, Boy Scouts, teachers, mail carriers. Teachers who were out of work from the closing of the school were asked to volunteer and actually to canvass from home to home to see how families were doing. So coordination between levels of government that wanted to close these schools were another issue. And the two cities had really different philosophies on whether they should close their schools or not. St. Paul's Board of Health, headed by Dr. Simon, said that school nurses were the best defense against the spread of disease, and closing the schools would allow school children's cases to go undetected. Minneapolis, Dr. Guilford disagreed, saying that the 30 school nurses they had would not be able to adequately care for the 50,000 pupils in this system.
And that was the last time that Minneapolis and St. Paul ever disagreed.
So really at the heart of this matter was whether or not the Board of Health had the legal authority to close schools. And Guilford in Minneapolis kind of threw down the gauntlet, and he said, "The direct snapping of the fingers of the Board of Education in the face of the health department is a matter that requires the attention of the courts. And if the justice system were not enough," he added, he intended to use police force. Children who were either in closed schools or not were encouraged to practice their own preventative measures. There was a poem that appeared in the Minneapolis Tribune. It said, "Protect your schoolmates from disease, use your handkerchief when you sneeze." Municipalities and governments also responded with additional containment measures, which sometimes today are called non-pharmaceutical interventions, community mitigation guidelines, or social distancing measures. Dr. Guilford in Minneapolis tended to be broadly proactive. Dr. Simon in St. Paul asserted that the isolation of influenza cases would be more effective in preventing the spread of disease. And so these two approaches played out in public spaces in really different ways. The Minnesota State Board of Health under Henry Brackett recommended that theaters, movie houses be allowed to open so long as proper ventilation was used and dangerous coughers were excluded. Dance halls and pool rooms, on the other hand, should be closed. Dr. Guilford ordered all Minneapolis schools, churches, theaters, dance halls, and billiard parlors to be closed, saying, "I do not want to be alarmist, but disease is not controllable by ordinary measures." The St. Paul Council did not follow suit, but did issue an emergency order regulating the business hours of stores and theaters to keep streetcar congestion to a minimum. And eventually, they closed their public places on November 6th. St. Paul also had a citizens committee, 15 physicians, church leaders, and community members who were recommending policy changes. Other measures of containment were suspending church services, asking people whose names were A or L to go to the 9 o'clock service, M to Z to go to the 10 o'clock service. And in saloons, each man was supposed to have 3 feet around him at the bar rail, and an inspector was sent out to measure that, because it wasn't quite enough work for them to do, right? Outstate these containment measures also were reflected. Northfield closed its public meeting spaces, and some of the schools that you saw in Northfield, Carleton, St. Olaf, had cases, 29 at Carleton, 41 at St. Olaf. Also, there were guidelines implemented for infection control. For the public, the Minneapolis Tribune noted that because of the widespread nature of epidemic, quarantine will be impossible, save as individuals and physicians are able to establish voluntary quarantine. Both cities attempted to combat influenza by limiting crowding in places. Both cities enacted streetcar regulations aimed to keep the air fresh by mandating open windows. This caused several complaints in Minneapolis because people were getting sick, or they said they were getting sick due to winter colds. So a compromise was reached, allowing streetcars with heating and ventilation systems to close their windows once the temperature dropped to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. St. Paul targeted elevators as a place where influenza could easily be transmitted. Buildings with fewer than 6 stories were not permitted to use their elevators. And in Chaska, where Anthony Simons died, mourners were so concerned about flu's contagiousness that they said their rosaries across the street and did not enter the parents' home. So citizens also practice infection control measures. In a little black box on the front page of the September 25th Minneapolis Tribune, they had some advice. Do this and foil the germ of influenza. Avoid crowds. Keep away from persons who cough or sneeze. Have all fresh air possible. Sleep with your windows open. Wear warm clothing. Keep your feet dry. And use individual drinking cups. People especially vulnerable to influenza, letter carriers, mass transit workers, others who came in contact with the public. People used over-the-counter remedies, some of which you see up here. Antiseptic powders, quinine, used to keep fevers down and malaria. Name brands like Dover's powder, a preparation of ipecac, opium, and potassium sulfate, used to induce sweating. And aspirin, which was fairly recent, maybe about 20 years available to people, but not fully understood because it was suggested that a person take 1,000 milligrams every 3 hours, the equivalent of almost 25 standard 325 milligram aspirin tablets. This is about twice the daily dosage generally considered safe today. And of course, medical resources were at the epicenter. Hospitals were placed off limit to all visitors. Private hospitals volunteered to relieve the city hospital of non-influenza patients. And reported on October 8th in Minneapolis, so many cases were taken to the city hospital yesterday that the attendants had not finished counting them last night. All of the city hospital ambulance have been turned over to influenza calls. Emergency calls are being answered by the police ambulance. The St. Paul mayor told residents, with more than half our doctors and nurses in war service, we dare not take any chances of a possible epidemic here, and placed patients in isolation wards in the city hospital. Nursing was a critical part of medical response, but nursing staff was contracting influenza as well, and hospitals were desperate for staff. So they reached out for volunteers, citizens committees, the Red Cross, and mothers to go and help people who couldn't manage their homes and take care of their children, including getting charitable organizations like the Wilder Day Nursery involved, because so many children were left either temporarily parentless or orphans because of the influenza. Economically, most of the evidence shows that the economic influence was short-term, but interestingly, it shows that it caused a reduction in human capital for individuals who were in utero during the pandemic, and that had economic implications for decades after the pandemic. There's lots of lessons to be learned from the pandemic, recognizing that there's a lot of differences between now and 1918. Just for example, there's a different understanding of privacy, civil and constitutional rights as it relate to public health. There's changes in transportation with aviation, personal computers, and understanding of diseases. And so how did it change in Minnesota? So because physicians weren't obligated to report cases to the authorities, they failed to see the pandemic coming. So the cornerstone of public health, epidemiology, the study of patterns, causes and effects of disease, now finally received full recognition as a science. Epidemiology requires data, so gathering data became more important. By 1925, all U.S. states had a national disease reporting system.
I'm sorry, whoever just coughed needs to leave the room.
They're reporting it. Public health policies changed, and the lesson health authorities took away from the catastrophe was there was no reason to blame individuals. And governments saw the benefit of starting to change their concept of medicine. In the United States, we went with employer-based insurance systems. Other places, other countries went with socialized medicine. And finally, in 1919, we saw the beginning of today's International Bureau for Fighting Epidemics, a forerunner of today's World Health Organization.
I had no idea that epidemiology owed its sense of, pride to the 1918 influenza pandemic.
Well, I think, and thank you, Ms. Henrickson. I think first thing I have to ask, and maybe everyone feel free to chime in, but I'll ask Dr. Osterholm, was this particular strain of H1n1 in 1918 especially lethal, or were there other circumstances that intensified its effects?
Well, first of all, one has to take a step back to understand what pandemic influenza really is. Influenza viruses are naturally occurring events in wild aquatic birds and have been for several hundred million years. And what has happened over evolutionary time is those viruses that attach to the cells of the intestine of the duck or other aquatic bird can't infect humans. But over time, if they were able to escape the aquatic bird and get into one of several other animal species, they then acquire the ability to basically, with a lock and key, get into the human lung cell. And the pig is one of the most notorious of all of the middle, you might say, game players, because they have receptor cells on their lungs for both bird viruses and human viruses. And so we get these viruses mixed up in the pig cell, lung cell, and they come out. That's where the term swine flu comes from. Now, we do know that in some cases, wild bird viruses can get into domestic poultry and then change there too, as we've seen recently in China and so forth. But to say that this, what happened in 1918 is our history, is really to say that's all our rearview mirror can see back. For those of us that have studied this carefully, we know that there were at least 16 influenza pandemics dating back to the 1600s. Hippocrates wrote about a very classic influenza pandemic that may have been every bit as dangerous and disruptive as was the 19 pandemic. So we have to be careful not to say that this was an unusual event, and that's one of the reasons why we're so concerned about what could be the next time we have a 1918 event, because history surely shows that that could happen. Now, in terms of was this a more lethal virus, during normal seasonal flu years, where we have different strains of seasonal flu virus, which, by the way, is the residual strains of a previous pandemic that hung around in people, you'll see very different patterns of illness in terms of whether they're very young or very old. For example, in 1918, the average age of deaths actually was about 28 years of age. In 1968 and 1957, 1968, when two additional pandemics came along, H1n1, H3n2, the average age of deaths was in the high 60s, which was much more what you would expect to see with life expectancy. In 2009, actually came along another H1n1, which didn't have the number of cases, but surely had a very significant impact on those that got it. And the average age of deaths in the United States was 38. If you adjust for life expectancy, the age of deaths in 2009 was younger than it was in 1918. And so flu viruses interact differently with different people. What we know about the 1918 virus, and we saw again in 2009, is the fact that these viruses actually cause the immune system of the host to react. Many of the deaths with seasonal flu occur when somebody develops a secondary bacterial pneumonia as a result of damage to the lungs. In this case, this caused what we call a cytokine storm. Cytokine storms are where you set off almost like a septic shock picture, but you don't have bacteria in your blood, and it causes severe damage to all your internal organs. Today, we can't handle these kinds of illnesses with this cytokine storm any better than we did in 1918. It's not about antibiotics. And so what we worry about is that coming back again, because in that case, modern medical science isn't going to do a whole lot for us. We have a machine called an ECMO machine, which can basically breathe and, in a sense, pump your blood for you that can help, but they're a very limited number. So we're just as vulnerable today to a 1918 pandemic as we were in 1918 in terms of that, if in fact it is this virus, human immune system response damage that occurs.
You had mentioned the progression from poultry to pigs. The working theory is that is how the 1918 pandemic started. Is that still something that people kind of believe or ascribe to?
Well, we don't know for certain where 1918 started. There is, I think, the most reasonable data actually says it may have been in Kansas, and it may have been associated with the military base there that actually were training for World War I soldiers. I might add that very few people realize this, but from a historical standpoint, 8 times as many soldiers died in Europe from swine flu as died from all the war combined. So it was clearly something that was on the mindset of the Defense Department. I might also add another very sobering figure. We have data from Boston, which is the best. More children in Boston died in October and November of 1918 under the age of 5 than died in Boston the next 20 years combined. So it gives you a sense of those 2 months period, what things were like. It was tragic. So I think just to come back and to say that today when we look at pandemic influenza, one of the things that we're very acutely aware of is the fact that we have a very different food production system in the world. To feed 7.6 billion people, the protein needs are so different than they were in 1918 even. Let me just give you an example. Any given month, 125 million new chickens are born in the peri-urban region of Shanghai, just to feed Shanghai. The average time from a chicken being hatched till it's on your plate is about 35 days. So every month, 125 million new chickens are born just there. When you look at the global distribution of poultry today, it dwarfs anything we ever saw in all of human history. And so we're seeing a mixing and a movement of influenza viruses in birds today that's unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented. And this is one of the reasons why we're so concerned about the future for pandemic influenza emerging again soon, is because of that. I mean, imagine in the old days, the flu virus may have had one throw in the genetic roulette table every month. Now it has millions and millions of throws virtually every hour. And so, we have to be prepared again, because this animal-human interface is moving these viruses a lot.
Is that why the Department of Health in Minnesota has the program Cockle-Doodle-Doo, Wash Your Hands?
Yes, well, I'll just add to take it to kind of the local level is that we do monitor in our influenza surveillance system, we do monitor for swine flu in humans. So in other words, humans who have developed influenza from swine, as well as we're looking for avian flu. And we do, I mean, this is not common, but we do get cases, and it is something that we monitor for. And in fact, even as part of the planning that is being done for high-path avian influenza, so focusing on what can happen to birds, we are part of the team that the Department of Agriculture has to make sure that we're focusing on worker health because of the potential and the issues for transmission between species. So we do look at that even today in our surveillance.
And if I could just add an additional piece to that, we don't realize, but we happen to be sitting on the mother lode event potential for that. And what I mean by that is, several years ago, as you know, we had an H5N2 avian virus enter into the state, had not previously been seen, and in Minnesota and Iowa, we lost over 50 million poultry as a result of that epidemic. It was incredible. What very few people realize is one of the highest concentrations of poultry production in the United States is Candiota County, Minnesota. You also know that one of the highest production capacities for swine in the United States is Candiota County, Minnesota. And you could not have put two mixing vessels together in a more concentrated manner than what we do in Candiota, Minnesota. And so from the standpoint of potential future epidemics emerging into pandemics, we surely worry about that a lot. And we now know today that these flu viruses out of the poultry barns may move 10, 20 miles in the wind. And that's why we had such a hard time containing it back in 2 years ago, because the viruses just blew across counties. And so today, we know that pigs get infected easily. So we don't have to look to China necessarily or some foreign country to know that we could have it right here in our backyard.
So it sounds like it's definitely a concern. How often does the flu jump from animals to humans?
Well, actually, it jumps fairly often, but the real challenge is, when does it then jump from human to human? And so we have a whole series of cases, H7N9, H5N1, a number of these flu viruses where we do get jumps into people. And in fact, we were very concerned a year ago with a strain called H7N9, which had not caused much illness in the birds, but humans in contact with these birds got it, and over 500 Chinese workers in markets handling the birds developed H7N9 in the 2016-17 flu season, and a third of them died. Now, the fortunate good part is that the virus was not yet genetically stable enough to go from human to human. That was kind of the next step. Once that happens, all bets are gone. When we watched the 2009 H1n1 pandemic emerge in Mexico, it surely emerged in a swine concentrated area. We believe that that's where it came from. And by the time we picked that up, which was probably a good month of transmission in Mexico, it was actually determined to be a new swine flu virus in humans by testing in San Diego, where somebody from Mexico City had come to San Diego, got sick, and were tested. And everybody thought, oh my gosh, we got to shut this down. Let's close the border for Mexico. And in retrospective, we realized that this virus was already in 28 different countries before we even picked up the first strain of it. And so once these things move, so today, the potential for these things to take off quickly is real. And all we're worried about is, when is the next time that one of these viruses is going to successfully not just make it to a human, but then a human's going to, in that case, be able to transmit it to other humans. And once that happens, we're off to the races.
So you mentioned the virus, or the things being in the wind. Do humans contract it from animals airborne, or is it from consuming the animals?
It's all airborne. And in one of the things we're learning about, first of all, I should have given a disclosure to this group before I started, so that you know that any conflicts of interest I have. I know a hell of a lot less about flu today than I did 10 years ago. And so take anything I say today with a grain of salt necessarily. We've learned so much new information about influenza in the last 10 years. And one of the things we've learned is that by far the most effective transmission may not be what we once thought. Surfaces probably play a very limited, if any, role at all. Yet we talk about hand washing and surfaces. droplets, which we thought were the primary mode of transmission, which are those big boulders we blow out that actually go no further than 4 to 5 feet, were thought to be the primary way. Now we have very good data showing that aerosols, the things that just me talking up here, that may fill this entire room in a matter of minutes. If you want to understand an aerosol, next time you go to a major department store and you're 4 aisles away from the perfume department, but you can still smell the perfume, that's an aerosol. And so we actually think that that has a very key role in transmission, which means then just being anywhere in public is going to facilitate the transmission. You don't have to be near somebody. The other challenge we have is we now know today that people may actually be highly infectious in the 24 hours before they have their first symptom. And so the problem you have today is that any one of us in this room could come down with flu tonight or tomorrow morning and be highly infectious sitting next to someone, and you appear to be completely well. And that's another challenge with flu transmission.
So Dr. Osterholm, you said that one of the theories of where that particular 1918 H1n1 originated might have been on the Kansas military base. I grew up in Chicago, where we're told stories of Mrs. O'Leary's cow and how that's what started the Great Chicago Fire. We now know that that's probably not how it worked. What are the theories on how the virus got to Minnesota, and are there anything concrete, or is it really just stories?
Well, first of all, even back in 1918 with limited travel, train, boat, I mean, remember what happened with it moving to Europe. You have to understand the speed at which this can move. Even with fast freighters, Europe was still 7 to 10 days away at that time in 1918. Yet we saw it get there very quickly. I mentioned earlier, with modern jet travel today, obviously we saw it in all these countries very quickly out of Mexico. So it's just the mere movement of people and goods that we move around. We move so many things. So just it's not surprising that when it emerged out of Kansas or wherever it really started from, it was within the United States in almost a month. Most states had it. Now, as Lois very nicely laid out, where it had its maximal impact varied in some cases by up to several months and several waves. There was a wave clearly in the early spring of 18 that was actually a much milder illness, and actually those people were looked to be protected against the subsequent, so that's what made us think this was a real wave. But something changed in addition to the virus, so when the September wave came along, it in fact was the very severe virus. In that case, we saw kind of the peak in some places in September, some in October, some in November in the United States, but it was across the world. And remember, by October, it was already having major impact on our troops in Europe. It was already impacting countries like India and China. So, I mean, it made its way around the world very quickly.
Now, in Minnesota, we all know that we're special. Was there anything unique about the virus's presence in Minnesota?
No.
I think Lois did a really good job, and I think this was a very important message for lessons learned for today. We live in a very different world today, so we can't go back and say what happened in 1918 will be what will happen today. But around communication, it's no different today than it was in 1918, and I think your very poignant stories of what happened between just Minneapolis and St. Paul. And if there's any one thing that's going to have to happen is we're going to lose public trust very quickly. When you have a crisis like this, if an earthquake happens, a tsunami happens, so many things like that, it happens and you go into recovery immediately. And when you can get into recovery, people have a very different mindset. But when the hammer is coming down on you day after day after day after day after day after day, fatigue starts to take over. When so many healthcare workers get sick and die, and you can't even staff the basic services, then you start to fray society in ways that we don't really understand completely here. And so I think that that's the challenge then, is who is going to be the voice that people will look to and trust, because they want that voice. And if you have mixed messages in public health, we are in big trouble, because at that point immediately the public will have doubt that anybody knows what's going on. So I think that your messages about 1918 were very key. The other piece I would just add about what's going to happen today, a pandemic today is going to take a toll much higher than 1918 if it's a 1918-like pandemic. And the reason for that has nothing to do with dying from flu. It turns out that when you look at the modern world we live in today, we have a large segment of our population that is being kept alive today on a number of very critical drugs that they need every day. And some are immunocompromised, some have cardiac disease, some have any number of different conditions. And we did a study several years ago where we surveyed a worldwide renowned group of PharmDs. And we said, what are those drugs you have to have every day or people die? Not cancer drugs as such, not most antibiotics, none of those, no lifestyle drugs at all. What's on the crash cart in the emergency room? And we came up with 28 drug categories, for which all 28 are generic, all 28 are made outside the United States, most of them in China. All of them have a razor-thin supply chain, meaning it's just-in-time delivery, and there's no stockpile anywhere. So if we have a major influenza impact in Asia that shuts down manufacturing, trade, travel, we will run out of those drugs quickly. And it wouldn't be surprising to me to see many more deaths loaded up front in an influenza pandemic that had nothing to do with flu itself. But you can't get if you can't get insulin, how many days can you go without insulin? If you can't get these drugs, and that's what's going to cause the first real wave or impact. That's going to be huge. And then the flu deaths will actually accumulate after that. And so I think people don't understand that even though we live in this modern medical society world, it's a very different world today from a vulnerability standpoint than it was in 1918, because people weren't kept alive on these drugs. They died. And so the people who died in 1918 largely died from influenza or its ancillary impact. And Lois again highlighted, the stories. Philadelphia is one of the cities that really described how many children starved to death in Philadelphia during the 1918 pandemic because both parents died, dead in the house, and nobody ever checked on them. And these young kids under age 5 eventually starved to death. That's how tragic it was.
Kind of ruined my next question with the dead kids.
Go for it.
I'm not diabetic. I don't have insulin in my house. Don't show up if there's a problem, because I won't have any to share. What lessons have we learned? You just said that if something like this were to happen again, that we're probably not particularly well situated to combat it. But with the population being so much greater than it was then, are there any places that are doing it right?
Well, nobody's doing it right, but let me give you some examples of people that are trying to make a difference. Right here in Minnesota, our Mayo Clinic has been one of the most thoughtful institutional organizations in the world in preparing for the next influenza pandemic. They've really done a lot of work. And one of the things they realized early on was there's no way in hell they could stockpile enough N95 respirators, the things that will actually protect healthcare workers against the influenza virus in its aerosol form. And so they're going to run out, and they're going to ask workers to come to work with no respiratory protection in what will be a hotbed of influenza virus. But they figured out that they could stockpile enough Tamiflu, the drug, and also rotate it, that they could provide Tamiflu to every one of their employees and all the employees' family members. And so today, if you work at the Mayo Clinic, you're actually guaranteed, if we have an influenza pandemic, you may run out of N95s, but if you get sick or your family members get sick, we will supply you with Tamiflu. So they thought about how to get ahead of the curve and because as a worker, I'm going to come to work, by God, if I know I have access to Tamiflu and nobody else does, okay? So I think that there have been creative things like that. What has actually been heartening for me, and Kris and others in the room know this, I wrote my first article in 2003 on why we needed a universal or game-changing flu vaccine, because the current vaccines were inadequate. In 2011, our group published the first seminal paper on showing how ineffective our current flu vaccines are, and that has been a deterrent to getting new and better flu vaccines because we can grossly overstated how effective they were. And finally, this year, there has been a real attention paid to we do need new and better flu vaccines. And I think that, in 1983, I got into a little bit of trouble, which those at the health department know is not unusual. I was quoted in the New York Times the day after Secretary Margaret Heckler from HHS and Bob Gallo, the co-discoverer of the AIDS virus, had a press conference and said, now that we've discovered this virus, we're going to have a vaccine in 3 years. And I'm quoted in that article saying, hell, we're not going to have a vaccine in my lifetime for AIDS. and for all the reasons why I laid out, but what I know about retroviruses. And of course, back then that was bad news. How could you say that? Well, here I sit in 2018, and we're not any closer to an effective AIDS vaccine today, despite spending $1 billion a year for the last 8 years on influenza or on HIV vaccine research. And so, having said that, that's the one honest side of myself. The other honest side says, but we do have enough data today to say we may very well be able to make a universal flu vaccine, one that you could give once every 10 to 20 years, because we can go at parts of the virus that actually protects you against multiple strains and for a long duration of time. And the problem was we just never did it. We didn't have a Manhattan Project where we basically crashed it, much like even we're doing with AIDS vaccines today. So I'm very pleased that that's finally gotten attention. Last week, the president signed legislation that actually appropriated $100 million to NIH to fast forward universal flu vaccine work. Now, that's surely a pittance of the amount that we need, and it'll take a while. But we're for the first time seeing that. And I actually envision, I mean, this is not pipe dreams. We could vaccinate the world one day like we did for smallpox and actually protect the world against a flu pandemic from ever emerging and have a major impact on seasonal flu every year with a vaccine that may only have to be given once every 10 to 20 years. Imagine that if we could take flu off the table. What an incredible human accomplishment that would be. It would rival surely smallpox in anything we did. I actually believe that's possible. It's just not going to happen today.
Well, and I'd like to give just a little bit of a positive spin in terms of where we're at, being prepared to respond to a situation. Certainly there's a reason that they call things disasters, and all of the planning that we do won't make a disaster go away. But we have had a lot more, when Lois was talking about sort of lack of coordination between government entities and things, I wouldn't say that we've reached nirvana, but we have certainly had a lot more communication, a lot more planning, and so I think we're in a better place with that than we were in 1918. I was, I guess, at the health department for a few years, but we started doing pandemic planning in 1999, and the phrase at that time was, the clock is ticking and we don't know what time it is, this sort of imminent doom. And when we started that planning, I mean, I was an epidemiologist, and I didn't have a clue about emergency preparedness. I didn't understand any of the resources that were available to the health department in terms of responding. And since that time, we have really matured. And again, I don't want to give the impression that, if we had a 1918 happen in 2018, that it would be a piece of cake by any stretch. But we really have our arsenal, I guess, in terms of just coordination and preparedness has really advanced. So we are participating with our partners in emergency response and emergency planning. And we do have surveillance systems. So as Lois said, influenza was not reportable back in 1918. It is a disease that we do surveillance on now, and our laboratory does a huge amount of testing. So when we are looking to see what's circulating, we actually have information to say, this is what's circulating in Minnesota, this is how it compares to what's in the vaccine. And occasionally we'll have a situation in which the lab is unable to really identify that what the virus that they're looking at doesn't match the reagents that we've received from CDC, which says it isn't what was expected, and we can follow up with CDC and with other laboratorians who can look into that. So we have systems in place that can help us be just slightly more prepared and not caught off guard, in the case of a pandemic. So as I said, I certainly don't want to give the impression that we've got it all wrapped up in a box, but definitely the surveillance systems that we have, we currently do surveillance in long-term care, in schools. We have sentinel sites, and we're doing surveillance year-round for influenza. So although you hear about it from October to May, kind of the peak flu season, we're constantly monitoring what's happening. So we've come a long way, but we have a way to go. And I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that when you invest in public health, and I'll say this because we are speaking here in the state office building. But when you invest in public health, you're investing in infrastructure that allows you to have the capacity that you need to respond to events. So whether it was measles in 2017 or it's the next pandemic that hits, it's important that you have infrastructure that allows you to be nimble when an infectious disease crisis comes along.
And if I could just add a piece to that, because I think Kris is absolutely right, and I think we've learned a lot since 9/11 about how to implement the incident command approach and how to bring together organizations. And I think in a very limited event, but yet a very critical event, the bridge collapse in Minneapolis was an example of where all that training and activity paid off, because it was a highly coordinated, very well done response to that. The challenge with flu that none of us are really comfortable with, prepared for, really takes a page out of the military. And that is, when you're in war, if your lieutenant gets shot and killed, your sergeant becomes a lieutenant. When your sergeant gets shot and killed, your private becomes the lieutenant. And what we don't think about is what happened in 1918, and we've seen happen in situations like this where those people who were in charge die. We saw that in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone with Ebola. The primary healthcare providers were all dying from Ebola, from their exposure. When you take that kind of leadership away, this is why when we talk about planning for this, you should be always planning 3 deep. So what happens when 7 of your top 15 public health people are either desperately ill or dead? What happens with your leadership in general? And so one of the things we haven't done yet is understood how will we respond when that valued spokesperson is no longer there because they're dead, which actually does 2 things. One, it takes their voice away, and again, it scares the public even more because the voice they had trusted is no longer there. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, and it comes back to Lois's earlier point about communication and who's in charge and how are they in charge. And so when we do tabletop exercises with organizations, the one thing that I love to do at one part of the tabletop, we suddenly take many of the senior leadership people and we tell them, you're now dead, you're now dead, you're now dead, shut up, you can't say another word. And suddenly they're watching their 3 deep, 4 deep people making all these critical decisions that never thought they'd have to make it because the boss was in the room. Well, the boss is now dead. You know, so I think that's going to be one of the interesting challenges, is how do we implement that, because it'll be across all society. It'll be healthcare workers, it'll be elected officials, it'll be ministers and priests and rabbis, almonds. It'll be the whole group will recognize the impact of that.
To that point, first of all, everyone should stop looking at Commissioner Malcolm. But what role? And I want the audience to come up with a few questions if you have some. So be thinking of that now. But what role could technology have in keeping healthcare leadership and healthcare workers safe? Something like telemedicine.
Well, I think that certainly is an option. We are looking to use it. We use it now in public health for directly observed therapy for tuberculosis, and it's used in part as a way to, sort of stretch resources, because oftentimes in greater Minnesota, when people are driving out to someone's home every day to watch them take medications, that's really time and labor intensive. So that's an option. But certainly with a strong infrastructure, that would be a way to avoid what Dr. Osterholm said was the aerosol cloud of spewing junk, because you can't do that via the internet. So there certainly are some advantages, but there are capacity issues as well with that. I think that I tend to be probably more optimistic than I should, but I think on the optimistic side, I think that we have come a long way in terms of our understanding. Back in 1918, they didn't realize that influenza was caused by a virus. They thought it was caused by a bacteria, and the vaccines that they were offering had completely the wrong organism, the wrong pathogen in it. We've got issues with our current vaccine, but we're a lot farther along in terms of our understanding of the virus, in terms of our understanding in public health. I mean, I certainly don't want to be the person that's dead in the next pandemic, but I do have great confidence in the staff that we have at the health department, we have a really great team that definitely goes beyond just some of the leadership. So I have reason to be optimistic, but I still dread the thought of a pandemic.
In fact, putting perspective to that, when you ask about technology, I mean, it really is vaccine, 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 vaccine. And yet today, on a global basis, we could probably provide even an ineffective vaccine by the second wave of the pandemic to less than 2% of the world's population. When you live in a global just-in-time economy, that means the implications will be felt worldwide, because the vast majority of the world will never have access to flu vaccine, even if we have it. And even if we have it, when will it get here? As our group demonstrated in a report that we did, by the time we got the flu vaccine in 2009, the peak of the second wave, the key wave, had already waned to the point of where we had limited to virtually almost no impact on the 2009 pandemic with flu vaccine. It was too late.
It took too long.
And if we could incrementally get that a little better, that would help. But still, for the world's perspective, there is no capacity out there to get the world flu vaccine. And so I think that one of the things we have to realize is pandemic is a worldwide event. Number two, we are victims of a worldwide event when the critical products and services that we need can't be delivered. And we outsource so much. I mean, something as simple yet as critical as the drugs. I mean, today, if I were to share with you, which I can't, but the number of areas we're concerned about in the military right now, where very key aspects of military operations are dependent on products that are made outside the United States. And we forgot about that. We just assumed that will be there. And so I think that that's key. The other thing I think is going to be a challenge for communication is, if we do have a vaccine, who gets it first? And we tend to go with our hearts and not our heads. So young kids and grandma and grandpa should get it first off, and we think about that. When I would argue, if you want to save more kids than grandpa and grandma, no. Make sure the people who run the electrical grid system get it first. Make sure that doctors and nurses get it first. Make sure, because I want grandpa and grandma to live, and the way they're going to live is if we don't have a breakdown, for example, of electricity, if we don't have a breakdown in certain critical movements of goods, if in fact we actually have a physician, nurses, and ancillary staff in a healthcare facility, if you do come in, that they can help you the best they can, which, by the way, most medical care will all be nursing care. If we want to understand the critical importance of nursing care, wait till the next bad pandemic. Nursing care will be job 1, 2, and 3, not intense medical care. And I think that that's what we also have to then adjust to, is that nature of that. That'll be important.
We're getting close to time, but I want to make sure we had a little bit of time for questions from the audience. Does anybody have anything?
Yes.
Jim?
A few years ago, there was quite a controversy in the scientific community about some researchers from the Netherlands regarding the development of effective communicable viruses. And I remember that you, at the time, had said, this is a national security problem, we can't let them publish this.
Right.
What's happened since then on that front regarding publication of potentially very lethal viruses, et cetera?
Well, first of all, I was an abysmal failure, okay, just so set the record straight. I was actually on the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, which is the government's oversight group. And what happened was a group in the Netherlands and a group in the University of Wisconsin-Madison both basically allowed the H5N1 flu virus to be recreated by passing it frequently through ferrets, mammals, that then made it mammalian transmissible. And what they were looking for, what are the changes that occurred? Now, had that virus gotten out, it's very possible that we could have had an H5N1 pandemic just from it alone, which, by the way, actually happened once. In 1976, H1n1 suddenly returned out of the blue. And we don't know where it came from, quote unquote, at the time, but now recognize in retrospect that that virus, which emerged in 1976, was identical to the virus that disappeared in 1957, hadn't changed. Well, it would have changed had it evolved over that period of time. And it turned out the Russians were actually doing vaccine research in eastern Russia using live attenuated vaccines, and they were using the H1N strain. And within 2 months, that virus was around the whole world. And it got out likely from the Russian labs, okay? So we know if flu virus gets out, it's gone, okay? There is no returning back. So what happened was the government kind of wanted an easy way out because there was a lot of issues about governing research, et cetera, and they got published. And the point of it was, for me, is that we do have research that we do need to do for answers that we need to have, but not to put it in the hands of potential terrorists or crazy people. You know, as we've seen, you know, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was nuts, but he made a hell of a bomb. And so we know today, the 2001 anthrax attack, I have absolutely no doubt that was a U.S. researcher from USAMRIID, the U.S. Military Research Institute, that did that, okay? So we want to be careful of how we share this information, and I believe it should be classified. Well, that finally came to a head last summer. I wrote about this in the book and was somewhat panned when I first came out a year ago, that the next one I really worry about is smallpox. And we have published all the sequences for how to make smallpox. Smallpox is a huge virus. It's like a 1,600-story genetic building, and we thought no one could ever do that. This past summer, a group at the University of Calgary actually made horsepox de novo, which is an identical size to smallpox, all the same issues, and they published it. And right now, there is an easy user's guide out there how to make smallpox virus. And now people are starting to wake up. In fact, I'm testifying at a hearing in a couple of weeks in Washington on this very issue about now the time people are starting to realize. The last thing I'd point out to you, remember cell phones 15 years ago? Remember those walkie-talkies we had? Remember the limited use for those cell phones? Today, think where we're at. Well, at the same time that technology has changed with our iPhones, Galaxies, whatever, lab technology has changed dramatically. We now have high school students and college students that can actually use tools in the lab that 25 years ago were only available in the most sophisticated government labs in the world. And so we've actually made it easier and easier for them to create these quote-unquote live bombs that could be used, and even if they're not even intentionally trying to hurt people, terrorists, once they get out, unlike a bomb that goes off and that's it, these will spread and spread and spread and spread. So we are very concerned about this, and I think you're going to see, and it's interesting because I was just in a discussion yesterday about the whole Facebook phenomenon right now. Finally, people are beginning to understand information dissemination can be every bit as dangerous, or lack thereof, as can a bullet or something like that. In this case, telling bad guys how to easily make something is absolutely as dangerous as can be. So your point's right on, and it's only becoming more of an issue, not less of an issue.
Okay, I think we are just about at time. Sorry, I think we have to wrap up. I'm sure some people will stick around afterwards and be able to answer any questions. So I want to, first of all, thank the Department of Health, Commissioner Malcolm. Thank you very much for putting this on and allowing us to come up here and talk about this. But mostly want to thank Dr. Mike Osterholm.
Thank you.
And Kris Ehresmann and Lois Henrickson for all of their information today. All of you for being here today, and everyone. And everyone on the internet. All right, thank you very much.